Across the country, Americans are taking note of a sudden burst of energy in the labor movement as major corporations like Starbucks and Amazon grapple with successful unionization campaigns. Led by a rising generation of class-conscious, economically precarious millennial workers, these new unions are confronting the power of some of the world's wealthiest, most politically connected oligarchs, and winning. Yet these high-profile victories are taking place in a political context in which union density remains at historic lows, and union strongholds like teachers and public sector workers are under continuous assault from a conservative judiciary and a corporate media apparatus that remains stridently anti-worker. What is the future of the workers' movement? Tonight, on International Workers' Day, we're exploring the state of the movement, its future prospects, and what progressives can do to be in solidarity with the workers of the world. It's The Facts with Max, and I'm joined this evening by Jonah Furman, an organizer and reporter with Labor Notes, who has been on the forefront of documenting the strike wave. Jonah, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Max. Glad to be here.
Let me bring you into the spotlight. I'm really excited for this conversation. I'm going to just be very straightforward up top. We're both tired. You were on a plane. I was at May Day parades all around the city. So everybody please bear with us if we're thinking a little bit slower than usual. But this is such an important conversation, and I couldn't think of a better person to have it with. And it doesn't hurt at all that you are a District 18 resident. So thanks for being here. Just a quick tech run through for the folks who are joining us live in the Zoom. We will be doing about 20 or 25 minutes of conversation just with Jonah. I've got some questions for him. And after that, we will open it up for Q&A. So if you have questions, you're welcome to chat them, but we probably won't get to them until a little later in the show. And you'll be welcome to ask them live at that point. So let's start with the stories that everybody's talking about, the big wins at Amazon and the increasing series of wins at Starbucks all over the country, including right here in Maryland and Baltimore. We have seen some really phenomenal and inspiring wins against corporate behemoths that seemed untouchable just a few years ago, or even more recently. Jonah, you're somebody who gets a lot of, backroom messages and things from organizers. What can you tell us about what we should take from these wins? What's there to be excited about? What is maybe the media getting wrong about these stories?
Yeah, great question. Also, shout out to Starbucks workers in Olney, even closer, who are organizing, have not yet had their election. I think the big thing about both of these, and I guess the headlines sort of reflected, is just how historic both of these organizing drives are at Amazon and Starbucks. So you have the second largest employer and the 11th largest employer in the country, neither of which have ever had a single union. Now having, in the case of Amazon, over 8,000 workers unionized in Staten Island. It's the largest single private sector union election victory since you'd have to go back to the 70s or 60s. Starbucks, on the other hand, you've had 200 stores file for elections at a scale. I mean, just that scale alone and speed, this is like sort of in the past 6 months, is just unheard of. So you have, if you look at the list of the biggest employers in this country, most of them have no union footprint at all. And not only that, but there's no effort in the labor, there's effort, but there's no success in the labor movement in trying to break into these big employers. Most of the labor movement is about defending what we've got and just trying to hold on. So this idea that you can sort of go on offense at big private employers and win, and do it at a scale and speed like this, it doesn't have to take 20 years. Obviously, these efforts have built off of years of, sort of generations of organizers. But the idea that we can go on offense right now And also that independent unions can do it. So in a lot of these cases, in the Amazon case, the Amazon Labor Union is explicitly a new union, not affiliated with anyone else, just self-organic grassroots group. And I have been in touch with some of them, and I can tell you that's actually true. And in the Starbucks case, they're affiliated with Workers United, but that's sort of a very loose affiliation. So in a lot of places, they're the first Workers United local ever. They're from Mississippi to Hawaii to Massachusetts to anywhere. I mean, they're in something like 30 some states now and in all sorts of geographies. They just won this weekend in Boone, North Carolina, which is not a union hotbed.
I saw that. That was 33-2 or something.
Yeah, yes. So they're not squeaking out wins either, So yeah. They are walloping these huge employers nationally in a way, with a speed and a sort of margin of victory that it just blows out of the water anything we've seen. So that's the biggest thing about it.
And in the case of Starbucks, I mean, maybe just because it's been a series of victories there, the response from corporate management has been sort of equally high profile, bringing back Howard Schultz from his disastrous presidential campaign. He's been, making statements and releasing videos that are extremely anti-union. It certainly seems like the company doesn't really know how to respond. And the response they've been trying so far, despite the fact that they're dumping millions of dollars into anti-union campaigns, is not really working.
Yeah, and also, I mean, something else is obvious here is how close this is to the corporate wing of the Democratic Party. So in the case of Starbucks, you have Howard Schultz, who was, came out after Hillary Clinton lost, came out as her choice of labor secretary, which is just very ironic, 6 years later. On the Amazon side, you have Jay Carney is their press guy, who's Obama's press guy. You have big Democratic Party firms working on the union busting campaign. So there is a moment here where you're just seeing both sort of inside of labor with these new unions and inside the Democratic Party establishment, seeing like, oh, maybe there really is a new sort of wing popping up, as we've been seeing for years, but is sort of making gains even outside of outside of Congress, outside in local areas and grassroots action.
That's and it seems like it bears saying that the fact that these kinds of conflicts even exist within the Democratic Party, the precursor to that is that there is no conflict within the Republican Party. It's an exclusively anti-worker phenomenon over on that side of things.
Oh yeah.
But within the Democratic Party, you're absolutely right. There are these contradictions. And I know that we wanted to talk tonight a little bit about, so Amazon, the win in Staten Island was very exciting and very high profile, but because seems like a slower process, these are larger, buildings to win contracts for. I haven't seen it quite as much of a reaction from the company foregrounded the way that Starbucks has. But in Maryland, we have a really interesting, very fraught history with Amazon already. And at this point, it's almost like down the memory hole because it's pre-COVID. But in 2018, Amazon led this huge, really sort of grotesque bidding war around the country for where it would locate its second headquarters called HQ2. And they had this list of like 20 metro areas. And they basically put on a beauty pageant for themselves where they asked all these different places, all these little local governments and state governments to put forward like sweetheart packages for them for choosing where to locate their headquarters. And Washington, D.C. was one of those locations, but also Montgomery County, right here where we are, was another area that Amazon was considering. And I went back and dug back through the documents from that time period, and I had forgotten that Maryland made headlines by being the state that offered the largest financial incentives package to Amazon of any location, including like New York, Toronto, really large metro areas. Maryland outdid them by several $1 billion. I think the total package that Maryland offered, when you added up all the tax breaks and other incentives, was something like $8 $6 to $8 billion, somewhere in there. If you read the fiscal analysis of the state bill that was passed, it was like a net loss of $5.5 billion of revenue for the state. It's worth, I want to ask you about what you think that means now in hindsight, and if a deal like that could be offered again in a state like Maryland. But I also just want to point out that expenditure of all, billions and billions of dollars was all so that Amazon would promise to create something like 2,000 jobs a year for 17 years. That was the bill's sort of terms. So it's both interesting to me on the surface level that if you actually do the math of dividing those billions by those jobs, you're talking about basically the state subsidizing each job by hundreds of thousands of dollars. But it's also interesting to look at what happened in the end, which is that Amazon went to Northern Virginia with their headquarters, and despite the promises, they have only created something like 1,000 jobs, maybe a few more, after several years. So it's certainly, hindsight's 2020, of course, but you have to wonder whether back in 2018, more state leaders should have taken a more critical look at who they were negotiating with and what they were offering. Because as we knew, certainly at the time, and even know better now, jobs in Amazon, these are tough jobs, and they had no labor protections when Maryland was offering this package. So I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, tons of thoughts. I mean, I think the place to start is like Amazon does not need incentives to create jobs. Amazon has something like doubled during the pandemic in their size. Obviously, it's run by, or formerly run by, Jeff Bezos, who was famously thanked his workers for sending him to space. So the idea that it's very transparently playing states off one another. We have this system where they can go to each state and say, if you don't give me enough, I'm going to go over here. If you don't give me enough, I'm going to go over here. Meanwhile, they're going to go where they're going to go. They are a hugely profitable company, and they don't need help from the federal government to be more profitable. So you have these states just begging at the feet of these corporations. What's interesting is that in the past, 6 months, it's totally flipped. You had in 2018 a lot of, state legislators and governors sort of supplicating at the feet of Jeff Bezos. And in the past just week or two, there's been introduced in New York State, where the union effort happened, a bill saying we're going to claw back any subsidies you have if you keep union busting. Bernie Sanders put out a letter saying we need to rethink the $10 billion package that Amazon gets from the NSA if they're going to be union busters. So just sort of like the union effort, there's some progressives have started to see, we can go on the offense. We don't have to just take the terms of the game. If the terms of the game are Jeff Bezos is going to ask you for $2 billion, and if you don't get it, he says, well, you just lost 1,000 jobs. If those are the terms, it's a losing battle. It's just a race to the bottom, obviously. I mean, that's transparent. So it's been interesting to see the pivot to going from begging for jobs that end up being bad jobs and end up being too few jobs in almost every test case. We saw a few cities go for it, like Fort Wayne, Indiana had this effort where they said no tax breaks for Amazon. Buffalo, New York had a no tax breaks for Amazon. These were local efforts. I think if we see this grow and sort of the common sense of states to be, we don't need to subsidize the most profitable company in the country, it could totally change the dynamic of who has the leverage in this situation. It should be Jeff Bezos and Amazon saying, we can promise this, this, and this, not the state saying we can promise this, this, and this, right?
It's interesting too to see the crucial role that organizing and labor organizing play in that dynamic, because it's unsavory maybe, but it's not hard to understand the political incentives that certain politicians might respond to, and thinking like, I can say I brought home all these these jobs to my communities. So yeah, it's worth it to me to make this huge financial outlay to try to get that win. And it's only when we've got this groundswell of opposition that the politics start to turn enough that those same politicians, in many cases the same people, suddenly feel like, I don't want to get near helping out Amazon. The wind's blowing the other way, so I'm going the other way. It's striking to me. That's why I guess why I ask, like, whether we think that something like the Maryland Prime Act, which, by the way, people should look up, the Maryland Prime Act of 2018. I mean, read it for yourself. It's a stunning bit of legislation, to put it mildly. But I find it hard to believe that you could see a critical mass of Democrats vote for that bill today the way that they did in 2018. But who knows?
Yeah, I mean, organizing makes the difference. Like, I think about Joe Biden talking about the UAW from the podium. The UAW represents, far fewer auto workers than work at Amazon, something like a fifth. There's like 5 times more Amazon workers than there are auto workers in the big three, in the UAW represented employers. But because they're organized and have built political power and built organized power, suddenly the establishment has to at least mention them, lip service, some comment, some deference, some consultation. But we've allowed Amazon workers to just be invisible because they're not organized. So who can speak for them? That was always the thing in 2018. Is people were like, I don't know, who can I ask? Or you can find an Amazon individual worker to say whatever you want, but until you're organized to speak for the collective, they have plausible deniability on whatever they want to do.
Yeah. That's a good segue for us to get into the area, the sector of employment that does have some amount of serious union density, which is the public sector. And here in Maryland, like most states, it's a vast disparity. It's something like 5%, private sector unionization in Maryland, but it's like 45% public sector. It's been a really important bulwark for labor, even as there have been these assaults on public sector unionization from the Supreme Court, and more recently during COVID, just kind of a full-scale media assault against teachers' unions and any public sector unions that are perceived as standing in the way of an artificial COVID recovery. So I wonder, what you think about the status in general of public sector unions in Maryland, stories we should be paying attention to here. Anything else you want to comment on in the public sector?
Yeah, I thought just last week, there was this interesting story of the workers at the WSSC, the Washington Suburban Sanitation Commission, something like this, Sanitary Commission, unionized finally with Teamsters Local 730, I believe. And they were able to do so under a law that was passed by the state that said something like, now either WSSC or all water utility workers in the public sector are eligible for unionization. So in this state, you need the state to pass a law saying you can unionize. What's so interesting about that to me is if you look at sort of international human rights organizations or the UN or anything, they say one of these basic human rights is the ability to organize, often to strike even, is listed in this language. But as a worker, you have the right to form collective associations. This is like a basic idea. You can gather together and choose to organize in whatever group you so choose. And in the United States and in Maryland in particular, we put checks on that, which is just totally, if you told someone from most other countries that there are laws saying you cannot have a union if your job is X, Y, and Z, this would like blow people's minds. And it's totally, it goes against basic ideas of sort of, what that's saying is if you talk to your coworker and you both decide that you need a raise for this job to work, and you talk to all your coworkers and they all say, we need $1 more an hour, whatever it is, we need $15 minimum. You are legally not allowed to take in certain forms that protest or that collective action together if you happen to work for the public sector in certain industries in Maryland. If you happen to be in a privatized contractor working next to those workers, you're totally allowed under federal law. You have to be given the right. So just thinking about that as a framework to start from, not as like it's up to workers to choose to unionize or not. It's not up to politicians. It's not up to people who don't have to wake up and go to that job 40 to 60 hours a week. And starting from that premise makes you think about our labor law a little differently. So, there's great public sector unions in this state, and increasingly it's spread, slowly we see bills passed allowing it in this group, in that group, this employer, this state employer, or this local employer. But it really, if you take a look at it and think about what does it mean to have the right to organize, how fundamental of a right is that, and who gets to decide who has that right? That's where I think of the Maryland state labor laws really, in some ways really far behind what we think of as like, you could drive over into Pennsylvania and suddenly everyone has the right. Do we think Pennsylvania is like some holy land of workers' rights? No, it's just some state law that said you're allowed and you're not allowed. And it totally doesn't really make sense if you stop to think about it.
Yeah, Maryland, it's one of only 3 states, is my understanding, that has this peculiar set of laws on the books. Basically, the law in Maryland is each local jurisdiction can decide independently whether collective bargaining is allowed or not. And it becomes even more confusing when you recognize the patchwork of jurisdictions. So you've got Montgomery County, for example, yes, collective bargaining. Gaithersburg, located within Montgomery County, no collective bargaining. And so you've got all these public sector workers, thousands and thousands of workers in Maryland who are carved out of the ability to organize in the workplace. And, one of the fundamental dynamics of labor politics is always the struggle for increasing union density, because when you increase the number of workers who are unionized, you improve working conditions for all workers, even workers who are not yet unionized. Not to mention, you make it just more. I grew up in the South, so I grew up in a context where there was very little union activity. And it makes a difference to live in a place where people are active in their unions and there's more talk about unionization. It strengthens everybody in the workplace. So to have this system in Maryland where we have all these places, the majority of our local jurisdictions that don't allow collective bargaining for public sector workers, it has a real impact on every worker in the state, even if you happen to live in a place that does allow collective bargaining. And you mentioned the sanitation workers bill that recently passed. There have been other sort of patches here and there. So like the public defenders were recently won a law that's going to allow them to form a union in their offices, that AFSCME fought very hard for. And there have been similar little tiny fixes like that. But what hasn't happened in Maryland is there has not been the political will to just change the fundamental law and say that we need to establish, a state labor law on a board that has the adjudicatory authority to enforce collective bargaining agreements for every public sector worker in the state, just like, basically any other democratic state that you could think of. And that is something that we're still waiting on. And it's unfortunate that we, in a democratic controlled legislature that is ostensibly pro-labor, we still can't get that done. Another issue that's sort of parallel to public sector workers is farm workers who, unlike many other workers, are not covered by federal labor law. They've been carved out of federal labor law, and farm workers often face some of the most difficult conditions of anybody in the workplace. Is there anything you can tell us about farm worker organizing or conditions in Maryland today? Things that we should know about farm workers here?
Yeah, I mean, I think it bears repeating that farm workers were carved out in the 1930s in the New Deal when there was federal labor law was written, and it was specifically, very much about race, very much about class, and who should be excluded from the New Deal sort of setup. Now, some states have taken action to change that. So just because you're not covered under the federal labor law doesn't mean there can't be a state labor law. Famously, California with the United Farm Workers, the Cesar Chavez movement, and and for decades and decades has been a force there. But even more recently, New York State, I believe, just legalized farm worker unionization, just maybe last year, 2 years. And actually, Maine passed a law, I believe, last year, legalizing farm worker unionization, which was then vetoed by the Democratic governor there. So this is another great example of a labor question which action is clear, what you could do about it. You could legalize, you could make it so that farm workers have the legal right to unionize and to bargain over their wages and benefits, which maybe this does bear repeating, but farm workers are, often making terrible wages with terrible conditions. Just some of the hardest jobs out there. And the state legislatures are empowered to make some headway on this. And it's just one of those things that nobody sort of champions it, so nothing ever happens on it. And I don't know the stats exactly how many farm workers we have in Maryland, but it's not just sort of a mega farm and you have to be driving a tractor or whatever. There's a lot of small local farms where workers aren't covered. I believe the first group in New York to unionize under the new law was a group of maybe 15 workers on Long Island, not exactly who you think of as farm workers in Iowa or in California. But there are groups of workers out there who just literally don't have the legal right to organize because it has for decades not been a priority for the people in power.
So I want to get us to our questions soon from folks who are watching along. But I wanted to segue to our last point here, which is if you can just give us a quick spin, Jonah, sort of on the point you were just making there about what other states are doing, and tell us about some of the other innovations that you're seeing in other states, positive ideas we could potentially bring to Maryland.
Yeah, just a couple that have stood out to me. We talk about legislation as like, how can it impact everyday people's lives? In Illinois, they just passed a law. I'd have to look up the exact details, but something like you get 10 more minutes break for every 4 more hours worked. This is like a direct impact of what private employers owe to their workers. And other things like you just get more time off, more time to rest. You can't be, I think they also changed it so you can't be scheduled more than 8 days in a row. Basic things that they sound like common sense, but there are many people living where they don't have a day off for a month, or they work 18-hour shifts with 1 30-minute lunch break. So Illinois it was very interesting to see that as these sort of like, we can just make these tweaks that enforce certain rules. One that was really interesting to me is in Oregon. So there was this big strike, the Nabisco strike, late last year in several locations, one of which was Portland, Oregon. And one of the big issues in that strike was you had workers, who are making like Ritz crackers and snack foods and things like that in factories, working like 80 hours a week. They would work wild overtime. And there was no check on this for the company. So they fought, they struck, they got an agreement in their contract that went some of the way, but then they took the fight to the state legislature and they said, okay, if you operate a bakery or a food processing facility, I think specifically they said in Oregon, bakeries and tortilla factories with over 100 workers or something like this, you would target maybe 300 work sites. You had to basically couldn't enforce mandatory overtime without certain incentives or penalties on certain behaviors. This kind of stuff is like bread and butter workers' rights stuff that there's no reason a legislature can't take up. And if you can't get it passed on the federal level, you can get it passed on the state level, especially when you have super majorities of Democrats. So just looking at the fights that workers are taking up and finding ways to say, look, if you can't win it in your contract, or if you won some of it in your contract and you want to enforce it at all the non-union facilities too, or all these different creative ways that you can say, we can legislate things that private employers do, especially the big private employers who there's no, there's sort of this idea that they're going to run off if you enforce anything, but it's just not true and should not be the first voice in your head as, supposedly the Democratic Party that wants to have workers' voices involved. So I think even just copycatting that, plus, what's just happened in New York with this Amazon subsidy stuff, there's all these creative things that we could just pull out of other states and try here. They'll need some tweaking for our different situations, but I just think we can get really creative and really concrete, right? It's a big deal to say you have 30 more minutes on your break. This is like life changing. This saves people's from injury, saves people's careers for longevity, and just improves the quality of life for working class people.
Yeah, and it's absolutely a huge site of struggle. I saw the meeting that Senator Sanders had with Amazon workers talking about their conditions and why they decided to unionize. And so much of what they were saying just boiled down to extreme overwork at their jobs, seeing colleagues pass out or literally have strokes and being told to get right back to work. Those breaks make a huge difference. I'm going to pick up a couple questions that came to me in the chat while we were talking and encourage folks to add questions in there as well. One person asked us to explain the Prime Act a little more. What would it have done? So very briefly, the Maryland Prime Act of 2018 earmarked a large package of subsidies for Amazon, tax incentives, and other types of breaks for the company if they would locate their headquarters in Montgomery County. And the terms of the agreement were basically Amazon would need to create a certain number of jobs over the next 17 years. I forget if there's 100,000 jobs, something like that. And in return, it's not 100,000 jobs, it's less than that, averaging to about 2,000 jobs a year. In return, the company would be eligible for all of these major breaks on things like sales tax, any taxes on transactions for acquiring materials, building, property taxes, anything like that. And the terms of the jobs were that they had to be, of a certain class. They couldn't be contractor jobs, for example. They had to pay a certain amount. So that was the Prime Act, and it was fairly unprecedented. It was a bill that was written specifically for just Amazon. And it had very broad support in Maryland. Democrats and Republicans voted enthusiastically for that bill. Other questions are coming in here. Are there any parts of the federal PRO Act, labor's #1 legislative priority, that could be broken up and passed locally? What a good question. Jonah, any thoughts on that?
That is a good question. And it's been a while since I've thought about the different pieces. I mean, some of this really, to go for the whole thing, you really do need action on the federal level. But some of it is, I don't know if this would be passing laws in particular, but a big part of the PRO Act, the Protect the Right to Organize Act on the federal level, was massively increasing the penalties for anti-union behavior. So just the idea that you're not going to do business with businesses that participate in this behavior, which is well documented. Obviously you wouldn't be able to use the mechanism of the National Labor Relations Board, but you could have rules on state contracts. You could have rules on, conditions for the workers in those state contracts. You could have rules for any subsidies for new developments. Sort of labor peace agreements is a big one. You'll see this actually right now. One of the most active groups of workers organizing are like marijuana dispensary workers, cannabis workers in Illinois and in Oregon, places that have recently legalized marijuana. And it's because when they created the industry, when they legalized the industry, they said, okay, you can open businesses, but you have to have labor peace agreements, meaning you can't bust the union. If the workers want to unionize, you are not allowed to do certain things that employers will do. So there's no reason you can't introduce that stuff into, whether it's new employers coming into the state or just taking a look at the big employers that already exist here and saying, if you're going to participate in this activity. I know, Max, in our neighborhood, there's Holy Cross Hospital that had a big union drive a few years ago, and I've heard stories, I don't know exactly what went down, but of some serious union busting there. And I haven't seen any politicians in the state, besides a kind word for the NNU, the union that was trying to organize there, say, here's how we're going to address the idea that the largest employer in Montgomery County in the private sector is engaging in this behavior. Has there been anyone looking into that? Is there any consequence for that sort of behavior. So I think a big part of it is just enforcement of what we already think our values are. The federal law already says unionization is in the public interest. It creates labor peace. We want workers to have a basic level of security to keep our economy stable and not have all these conflicts of people jumping, great resignation and jobs moving here and the supply chain getting all messed up. You see this stuff partly because there's very little stabilizing hand from the state saying, whoa, you can't do this crazy stuff as an employer. So I think the PROACT stuff that I think about bringing locally is more piecemeal, but it's like you could look at your local economy and say, these are the actors that are preventing a basic level of unionization that would be healthy for the workforce. And you can target, certain things you can do saying, this is what's out of bounds. It doesn't mean poof, everyone has a union and they have a 10% raise. That's not how it works. But you should at least have the chance, a fair shot at having a voice on your job if that's where you choose to take it.
I see another question here that might be related to what you're saying, which is what kinds of actions can state legislatures take to support Starbucks and Amazon facilities that are trying to unionize?
Well, some of it is just a bully pulpit, bringing workers into the spotlight. Something I think that's really interesting is before the Amazon effort in Staten Island, you have the second largest employer in the country. And unless you know someone personally, you can't name a single Amazon worker who works in a warehouse. Like we as a country, as a public, do not know the workers who run this country. We don't give them a platform. We don't put them out there to speak. And that's part of what organization is about. And it's up to the workers to pick leaders and find ways to do that. But at the same time, you've had people like, again, Senator Bernie Sanders bringing in striking workers to Congress to address the powerful, to be put on the stage. So part of it is just using the bully pulpit. It would be a huge deal if tomorrow you had a Starbucks worker testify to the Maryland state legislature about what's going on. It would also be a big deal if you showed up more than you currently do. So again, the bully pulpit thing. In terms of, action, you have to figure out sort of how these funds are allocated, but often the state has some role in new development and expansion of businesses. Like you're letting permits go through or you're subsidizing some construction project for the new like strip mall that's being created. There's little local things that you can say, look, here's the rule. If your company is going to keep behaving like this, then you don't have access to certain state assistance. We subsidize our corporations in this country like nobody's business. And some of that does happen on the state level. So I think, again, it's sort of, there isn't a blanket fix for it, but a lot of it is sort of not staying neutral because it's not a neutral fight when it's, 30 baristas in Olney versus Howard Schultz.
Right. Very true. Like envisioning that fight taking place in different ways. Jonah, this is great. I really appreciate you being here with us tonight. Somebody had asked, we're not going to have time to dig into it too deeply, but somebody asked, who should you be reading on labor issues in the US? I'll tell you who. It's this guy right here. Follow him on Twitter, subscribe to his newsletter, subscribe to Labor Notes while you're at it. It's a pleasure to have you in the districts, Jonah, and so appreciative of what you shared with us tonight. Before folks go, I do want to say, if you enjoyed this experience, we are going to do another Facts with Max on Monday, May 9th. We'll be with Lee Goodmark, who is a researcher studying the impact of criminalization and incarceration on domestic violence and intimate partner violence. Should be a really interesting conversation. Check out our website to find out how you can sign up to be part of that conversation as well. And please share the word about our campaign, max4senate.com, for like the number 4. This campaign is going well. We want to keep getting the word out there. So share this recording. And thanks for being here, everybody.
Thanks, Max.